Welcome to My Kind of Country. I'm Layman Pascal, and this is a new integral stage series. We already have a line of conversations called Love the System, in which we explore protocols, procedures, projects, and to some degree politics. But this series is more personal. It's about eliciting stories, histories, and reflections on politics, nationhood, and civic engagement from people in the developmental, transformational, and regenerative space. What have you seen? What have you done? What have you felt? How has your sense of your country changed? Where is it now? Where could it be or should it be going? Stuff like that. Today we're joined by author, educator, and father Brad Kershner, whose work is often at the nexus of politics, spirituality, and developmental pedagogy. I love saying the word pedagogy. I used to hate it. It was needlessly arcane and elitist, but now I can't get enough. Hi, Brad.
Hey, Layman. Good to see you.
Uh, Tell us what country you live in.
I am currently living in the great United States of America, and I'm in the state of Pennsylvania, about 25 miles west of Philadelphia.
Okay. Do you love your country, or what would you say is the
Hmm.
general emotional tone that connects you to it these days?
Hmm. Yeah, interesting question. I'd say, yeah, there's a lot of layers of feeling there. I think part of what myself and a lot of us are feeling is this sort of collective stress and anxiety. I feel like is present in the air. I feel like there's also tension between groups of people that is part of what constitutes our feeling of being in the country right now. So for me, there's layers of, I feel like, awareness of how people are feeling and sort of having a sense of the collective field of emotionality and tension and anxiety. So then being aware of that, but then also trying to bring like some compassionate sense to that, like trying to hold other people's feelings, I feel like is how I'm orienting toward it. Um, Trying to understand why people are feeling stressed and tension, trying to understand why people are feeling maybe heightened concerns about the state of the world, the state of the country. I live in an area where there's some good political diversity. Like you see signs for red team and blue team all around. Sometimes neighbors will have opposite signs, and I often wonder how they're feeling in their relationships. Like, how does it feel to say hello to your neighbor when you can see that they're so aggressively and prominently and publicly displaying that they have the antithetical values that you do, or at least that's how it appears. So I feel like my feeling about my situation here is just wrapped up with really my interpretation and understanding of how I'm experiencing other people. Because for myself, it's not so much. I feel like I'm able to mostly avoid getting caught up in the emotionality that I see manifesting in other people, but I'm trying to keep my heart open to what they're going through and why, and trying to understand that so that I can let in whatever I need to let in so that I can stay tuned into what's happening in the country and the world, but in a way that doesn't pull me down into any of the what seem to be sort of psycho-emotional cul-de-sacs that I see people getting caught up in.
Have you spent much time in other countries?
Not recently. When I was in my early 20s, I did some traveling. I took a break from college and spent a few months traveling throughout Europe with my sister for a few months, which was a life-changing experience. I turned 21 on Santorini Island in Greece. And that was, yeah, that's a whole other podcast episode. It was a life-changing experience. I met some amazing people, traveled with some brothers from Australia who had lived in India and just, learned a lot. And I've been to India twice, once with my family and once with a friend, and had some profound, meaningful experiences. In India, I've been to China for an educational conference where I gave a presentation at a conference in China. And that's about it in terms of my international ventures.
So I guess the question is, what did any of those other spaces and contacts with people from other countries show you about what it is to be an American or what it is to be perceived to be an American.
Mm. Yeah, it is interesting. There's sort of a joke when traveling, I remember coming up of not wanting people to know you're American. So some Americans even travel with like Canadian flags on their bags. You almost want to go undercover and pretend like you're a Canadian because people like Canadians more than Americans, I think. I remember that coming up. There's almost sort of a shame of being a United Statesian American when traveling. So that impression stayed with me of at that time feeling like the sort of evil empire sort of notion is out there, sort of America as police, America as dominant hegemony, and almost a sort of shame about that, I feel like is present. And but at the same time, there's the flip of going to a place like India, and whether you're American or not, being a privileged sort of light-skinned person, there's definitely a perception of that and a heightened awareness of privilege and ability to travel, being asked for money a lot, just awareness of wealth that we kind of take for granted, even if you don't think of yourself as particularly wealthy in the United States, you immediately are when you go to India. And I think that's healthy to be awakened to that and have to have that visceral experience of being mobbed for money is a sort of intense one. And when I traveled with my family, my daughter was maybe like 10 or 11 in India and had some real visceral experiences that she did not like, you know, being seen as an object of interest and being so different, you know. But I think overall that was good and healthy for her and for us. And actually, just as a quick side note, so much so that we as a family are planning a sort of family journey after she graduates high school. We want to actually take some months and travel the world together because we think it will be good for her overall human education to get a broader experience of the world. So behind that is that sort of pedagogical implication that it is good for one's experience and one learning to experience other cultures and places. So we're going to actually try to unfold that for her before she goes to college.
Well, let's go back. Let's go back further. Where does your awareness of the nation and maybe your awareness of politics, where does that start? What are your earliest memories of the political and maybe even spiritual existence of the United
Yeah.
States arise?
Yeah, I think as a child it was pretty limited. I grew up knowing that my family identified mostly as Democrats, so I had that sort of really oversimplified notion that blue was good and red was bad. And that seemed really obvious to me really through college, even like through the Bush years, it was really clear that Bush was bad and the Democrats were better. So I kind of stayed in that sort of really simplified, socialized group identity for pretty long, really. I think kind of even almost through carried it through Obama, like really from childhood through the Obama years. I think had a pretty consistent group identity of more Democrat, less Republican, and kind of took that for granted. So it's really been interesting in more recent years to see that problematized and opened up a little bit. And almost looking back on it, it's almost kind of embarrassing to see how long I held that some of the assumptions baked into that group identity and the simplicity of that. As a country, you know, there's so many mixed signals I think kids get. I think as I was not unique in that you get these really contradictory messages, you know, there in some sense you get the story of the founding fathers and the goodness and importance of democracy, and you get the progressive positive story of how things have gotten better over time in the country, but it's also definitely layered in with elements sort of as I related before, elements of shame, elements of strong critique, elements of, you know, feeling like things are bad and things have been bad, and then the way that that's also racialized and the way that that becomes part of the identity of a young white American, I think is sort of interesting to have to navigate. Do you fall on one side or the other of that and sort of suppress the other side in your identity, or do you find a way to actually integrate both somehow? And I feel like I didn't really do a lot of conscious work to find a higher order integration that contrast of both like the pride and the shame of the American story. I think like probably most people my age, you just sort of navigate mostly unconsciously through that and try not to think about it too much, except for every 4 years when it's really pushed in your face and you have to vote. But I think part of the learning journey there for me is, yeah, just becoming more conscious of all that, complexifying that, sort of getting out of that tendency to just, okay, I'm just going to fall on this side of that identity and repress the other side. So it's complicated, and I think kids get a lot of mixed messages and aren't really held through the process of understanding the tensions between the good and the bad, the dignities and the disasters of the modern democratic world.
I'm curious how politics got discussed in the house. So right, obviously they were identified as a family with Team Blue, but was it something you guys talked about? Was it sort of analyzed and picked
Mm.
through as family discussion, or was it just more of a vague group identity?
Yeah, it was vague. It was vague, and it's interesting now. Now, as a parent, I'm realizing that, yeah, try not to overdo it, but I'm trying to help my daughter be more aware than I was at her age. I think we just took so much for granted. It's sort of like how you still see people now with the signs of like Harris, obviously. I feel like that was sort of the tenor and the tone of a lot of Democrats for many, many years. It was always sort of like not Bush, obviously. Obama, obviously, right? Like if you get it and you're in the in crowd of this sort of middle class, upper middle class liberal Democrats, it's so obvious you don't really have to talk about it. Um, and I think there's a lot of blind spots there. So I'd say that was pretty much my default experience growing up, was you don't really have to talk about it. It's really obvious that those of us who live in more urban and diverse areas and who have education and who go to college see all these things pretty clearly. And this is the group of people who identify with them, and those other people are the people who really don't understand, and maybe they're racist or maybe they're just not as cultured or educated, yada yada yada. So not really explicit. I think all of that was pretty tacit.
I think a lot about different kinds of I don't want to just say voting systems, but like collective decision-making protocols of various kinds. And when you bring up things like that, or when you take it to a referendum, even if it's just ranked choice voting, but especially if it's transferable vote or proportional representation, everybody says, well, it's just too complicated for people. We understand this sort of basic show of hands, and then somebody wins a region. We understand that, but it's partly because we've been trained in that. Like when I think back to my childhood, how many people want to go left and how many people want to go right or whatever. We practiced it all along. So of course it seems obvious to us. I'm curious when you look back, what kind of training, explicit or implicit, do you feel like you got as a participant in political processes?
Hmm. Yeah, not much explicitly. To me, I feel like we all just and part of my growth in more recent years is just seeing how social we all are and how socially pressured we all are. So much of our decision making and thinking and identity is framed by these social pressures and group identities. And we even if we're sort of led to think that we have shaped and have been helped to shape sort of coherent political worldviews and philosophies, it actually can be revelatory to realize the degree to which it is maybe more the case that our groups sort of tell us what to think than we choose our groups based on what we think, right? And so I don't feel like that was a part of my education to be sort of cultivated into political decision making. And I feel like in retrospect, I can kind of see how how much I took for granted just because of my socialization. And then seeing how true that is for other people as well, it does sort of raise some interesting questions about what would it take to actually have people be prepared for, educated for, oriented toward good sense making, good political decision making, right? And that the sort of tension at the heart of democracy is it kind of depends upon an educated public and people who are informed and able to make decisions, but that sort of presupposes an individuality and agency of the rational individual decision maker, which is maybe largely a fiction or not what it appears to be.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you've heard me suggest that we should have secret ballot in the legislatures
Mm.
as well, because we
Hmm.
introduced that in the general public because we understood people
Hmm.
can't vote their conscience if other people
Hmm.
they know are watching.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there was something even that happened recently with like the Speaker of the House vote or something where because it was secret ballots, people were able to kind of go against maybe what otherwise they would have been pressured to do what Trump wanted them to do. So yeah, the sort of privacy of it is also key. Even now too, I feel like there's real tensions around that of like, are you a public Harris or Trump supporter, or are you able to sort of stay more nebulous? And is there wisdom in that? So yeah, there's sort of the private public socialization part, but there's also just the even deeper question of, what does it take for one to be a sovereign agent of their own sense making and decision making to make good choices? And does a health of democracy depend on that and that which we are so far from attaining as of yet?
Do you think that kind of sovereignty of political decision making is something that's gotten better or gotten worse in your reading of American
Mm,
history?
mm. Good question. I don't know that I know. It would be interesting to somehow have meaningful data to assess that. I feel like some things that I've read give the impression that there were periods of time in the past when people who were in the voting population were actually fairly well educated, right? Like even in terms of things I've read about the effects of public education and how actually literacy rates have actually gone down since the advent of public education in some sectors, because in the sectors of society that were educated, they were highly educated and literacy rates were incredibly high. For instance, like in the Northeast, amongst I don't know how it splits in terms of men and women or class, but there are some set of people in which literacy rates and education rates were very high. And public education has had a sort of weird effect of sort of spreading the span, but maybe decreasing the depth would be one way of looking at it. So I think I don't really know what data to trust on that, but I don't think it fits a simple linear narrative that we're just becoming more educated and better informed over time. That does not seem to be the case. And if anything, I think there's definite regressions possible and that we might be actually witnessing. So my sense is that right now we're in a sort of regression, although we're striving for something that is in some ways unprecedented, which is everyone being informed all the time about everything, right? Like that also wasn't even conceived as a possibility maybe in the past. So I feel like we have this new sort of ideal of like everyone could know so much that's happening in the world, to have all the information at their fingertips, that we could have every person be so informed. But the reality is such that we're so far from reaching that. Yeah.
Did you have any engagement with student politics or anything like that?
No, not really. I was pretty disengaged. I mean, my mode as a adolescent was just to be above it all, and not care, be kind of too cool for school kind of thing. It seemed so, I think because the engagement was so lackluster and not meaningful, that a lot of folks in my social circles just kind of checked out and were not really politically engaged or even socially engaged, like really couldn't care less. And I think we have to, it's an interesting question because there's stages we have to go through as young people to sort of disengage or something from the adult world to sort of find ourselves, but how do we keep young people engaged in a meaningful way? Is definitely an open question and something that we could do a lot better at than we do. And I feel like I see even like some of the young people I know now, I feel like are actually doing a better job of that than me and my peers did when we were young.
Yeah, when I think about my own life, I mean, I had an early, really strong kind of patriotic feeling,
Hmm.
and a love of political comedy, which was a lot on the CBC radio.
Hmm.
So it gave me an interesting sense, but I never had any interest in being involved in student politics and only got on the
Hmm.
student council in the last year as a result of a bizarre set of circumstances.
Hmm.
But when I look back, I think, boy, what I saw there really informed my ability to think
Hmm.
about the moods and the systems of politics because you're in the group, you're recording the votes, you're
Hmm.
participating, you're
Hmm.
forming alliances. You get a sense of like, oh, this is kind of how this works.
Yeah.
And if I hadn't just stumbled into being on the student council, I wouldn't have seen any of this, and it wouldn't be part of the sensibility I would bring to subsequent engagements with politics in my country.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's interesting to be how being in a concrete situation, even in just a small scale, can open up insights into the complexities of larger scales. Like for me, just working in schools kind of does that a little bit, like just seeing how complicated things can get in an organization, having to make decisions in a relatively small group of people, the kinds of divisiveness and disagreements that can arise, and the ways in which just collective decision making and collective sense making can get really, really, really tricky, even at a small scale, to think about how complicated it is to scale that to larger venues like a state or a nation. It's just, I think we all maybe just don't appreciate really how amazing it is actually that things are as well functioning as they are. Even if it's a total shit show, it's actually still also kind of amazing the way that this country's holding together and the amount of stuff that does get done and the amount of goodness that's happening. It's actually quite marvelous. Mm.
You know, one of the things that stands out to me as a difference between my country and yours is that there's a lore of these great men who were the leaders of your nation. And I mean, we have prime ministers, but nobody thinks about them here like
Hmm.
Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln,
Hmm.
Roosevelt, my God, right?
Hmm.
Uh, did you grow up having this feeling that there were some
Hmm.
developed, wise, powerful people who stood at the fount of your nation? Like, did you? What was your feeling about these
Hmm.
legendary, great American leaders?
Yeah, no, good question. I think I've had to more come to appreciate that as an adult. I think in youth it was more, unfortunately, the sort of cynical, negative, deconstructive side of like, yeah, not really wanting to put those people up on pedestals and having grown up more on the left side of things, this sort of knee-jerk inclination to not feed into that and then actually only later realizing actually how legit amazing those people were. And if you understand in their historical context and you actually read what they wrote, which not many people do, and which I don't actually remember doing much of through my formal education, like actually reading the writings of the founding fathers, so to speak. It's not like we read the Federalist Papers or, anything like that. But if you were to do that, it is really quite impressive. And I feel like that's something that it's an interesting thing to try to come to appreciate and integrate in the historical sweep of yes, the severity of the problems and the difference of the historical context and the norms, and yet the the greatness and the intelligence and the value that does actually shine through those people's words and work is really significant. And my sense is that it's greatly underappreciated. Sort of ironically, because maybe in different parts of the country it's flipped and they're too much put on a pedestal with not enough critical reflection. So maybe it's one extreme or the other. But my sense is that the actual value and importance of what they accomplished, what was accomplished, is greatly underappreciated. And we're sort of due, I think, for young people to get a better sense of like how to appreciate and understand the goodness and the value and the merits of kind of what we're all benefiting from. Really, it's sort of sad that we're sort of all benefiting from this rich legacy of these systems, um, and just this whole society has sort of been handed to us, and we're so immaturely critical and cynical about it all. I think it's quite sad if I think about it like that. And
Well,
I'll just add to that
yeah.
too. There's a people like we could be inspired to greatness. I feel like that's something that's missing from our messaging to youth is we actually could and should still be inspiring young people to greatness. And it actually is as a sort of tried and true way to do that is to show models of great people that people can aspire to. And I feel like pedagogically we've kind of lost that impulse in the culture for complicated reason. And that's something that I think we have to find a way to reclaim because potentially it's really beneficial for young people to have exemplars that they can try to live up to.
Do you think those exemplars intrinsically need to be simplified and mythologized? Right?
Mm,
Does the human complexity of their embedding in their lives and their body and the social circumstance, does that undermine their greatness and their ability to function as inspiring exemplars? Or is there a way to handle it where all that complexity's in there and we just don't demonize it?
yeah. Yeah, no, I think we have to try to do the latter. And maybe that's the key difference that we're trying to figure out is moving from a naive, oversimplified hero worship to a sort of overly critical, cynical deconstruction. So now the next move in that process is to like, okay, how can we give a realistic, historically uh, contextualized, accurate, nuanced picture of why what has happened is still really of value and why we can learn from it. But again, then, that's harder to do, obviously. And then you get into questions of what is necessary from teachers and students in order to do that well and tell that story well. And is that something that's just legit hard for people to do? But it's still what we have to strive for, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it would be nice if we had the institutions and habits in place to make people capable of harder things.
Hmm.
But when I look at the American situation right now and maybe the global situation, it looks to me like there's a kind of a standoff between groups that are promising to take more variables into account and groups that are promising to take fewer variables into account,
Hmm. Hmm.
right? And it's pretty tempting to want to say, like, hey, I feel overburdened by the number of concerns and things I'm asked to track. I would like somebody to massively simplify this so that I feel I have freedom and agency back. Problem
Hmm.
is, we were tracking those concerns and variables because we decided they were probably important. So you end up slashing and burning a lot of stuff.
Hmm.
But I wonder how you relate to that sense that the political
Hmm.
divide is a bit between the more variables groups and the fewer variables groups.
Yeah. Yeah, that's definitely hard. I mean, deciding what is relevant, right? It's a sort of collective relevance realization is what we're asking for. Like, how do we decide what's salient and important and how to key in on those things which are most yeah relevant to whatever the conversation is. There's some sort of judgment and intelligence that has to be active there, and the activity of that sort of selection process and how intelligent and thoughtful it is versus how manipulative and strategic it is maybe really the question. I guess I see it more as different groups for various reasons selecting certain things to focus on for various strategic and manipulative purposes, and thus sort of making the whole conversation harder and less helpful because you have these different groups caught up in these games that they're playing with each other where they see it as oppositional and sort of win-lose dynamics where they're perpetually trying to focus on certain things for reasons other than just the impulse of what's best for all, what's true, what's helpful. If people were oriented toward trying to answer the question, what should we be focusing on? What should we be bringing more detail and nuance to versus what should we be simplifying? If we were making those kinds of calculations based on clear and good and pure intentions and values and principles, we'd be in a very different situation than we're in now. So I think underneath that is the problem of what's even our orientation toward these questions and problems, and why are we doing what we're doing, basically. And my sense is that the default for most people is still the why underneath a lot of behavior politically is, you know, this is the strategy that's going to help my group win in this contest. And that is of prime importance because the stakes are so high, because the other group is so bad and dangerous, and bad things will happen if they have the political power. Therefore, we justify strategic manipulation of truth and information and reality and political processes. So we're sort of stuck in this end justifies the means, I think, underlying architecture for collective decision making and thinking, right? So somehow we have to get out of that so that we can even address the question you're asking in a more humane, humane way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
so. Let's come back to your life.
Mm.
What was the first election you remember noticing that it was happening?
Mm. Yeah, I think I remember Dukakis, Michael Dukakis, I think was a Democratic presidential candidate. I think my dad was voting Dukakis, and I think he lost. Obviously, he lost, but I don't really even. Um, I remember Dukakis, then I remember Gore and Clinton. See, I was really just like, from the late 80s into the 90s, just knowing about the presidential candidates. Yeah.
Trying to try. Was Dukakis, was he running against Reagan?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember. Or was it Senior Bush? Uh,
Um, I think Clinton ran against Senior Bush. I don't know if
yeah,
Dukakis ran against him.
yeah.
What was your impression of Reagan?
Yeah, I didn't know. That's the thing. I mean, I was pretty ignorant, back as a teenager. I really wasn't tuned in. And the thing is, we didn't really like. How would I have been? I would have been like reading the newspaper, right? Like it's funny. I mean, I grew up in the '80s, and 80s and '90s. I mean, no internet. I didn't watch like news on television, so. I grew up in Ohio, in a suburb of Cleveland. So, yeah, I wasn't reading the political section of the Cleveland Plain Dealer, and maybe my parents were, but I don't think they really were either. So it wasn't really very robust. And maybe it's just me projecting, but my sense is that, nobody who I knew growing up gave a shit, frankly. We're very politically unengaged and sort of in that sort of default, sort of postmodern cynicism of just like really not caring and being mostly oblivious to what's going on in the world, frankly.
Yeah, I got it through entertainment, really.
Mm.
I mean, I think I
Hmm.
heard people do
Yeah,
impressions of Reagan. I knew like Evil Empire and
yeah,
oh, he's some kind of cowboy actor thing.
yeah. No, great point. It's probably similar for me too. Is actually through, yeah, like I was aware of Rage Against the Machine more than I was aware of what they were referring to. And I listen to mostly rap music, so it's like I got my politics through Wu-Tang Clan and KRS-One mostly.
So what about Clinton? I mean, Clinton is a pretty
Yeah,
engaging human being. Whatever one
yeah,
thinks of his politics or personal dealings in the
yeah,
world, a lot of people are like, well, this guy's kind of a affable, exuberant political genius somehow.
yeah,
He just seems to roll over a lot of phenomenon. What
yeah.
was your awareness of him as a character?
Yeah. Well, again, back then, not much other than superficial, but I think it's interesting more from the standpoint of now, like how many iterations of different understandings of people like that we can go through as we get older and mature. So it's like your superficial impression of someone like Clinton based on your family and where you grew up and what media you absorbed versus like a decade later based on maybe you've heard things about the past of Clinton that you weren't aware about in the present that sort of recalibrates your thinking about who this person was. And then fast forward another 10 years and it's like, oh, wait a minute, thinking about like potential connections to people like Epstein and then other analogs like Obama. I think for a lot of people, Clinton and Obama are kind of in a similar category of like the kind of suave, successful, intelligent, blue politician who has many layers of what's presented to people's awareness, and there's this sort of superficial, and then there's this sort of people who dig down into like what's really going on behind the scenes and looking more at like policy, like wait a minute, how did Clinton policies actually play out for the country, and like unpacking this sort of culture war dynamics between someone like Clinton and Gingrich, which were very on the surface, like these guys were mortal enemies. But then underneath that, economically and in terms of policy, actually, they're very similar and they shared what could be called a sort of neoliberal consensus. And so it's just like there's so many layers to it, and there's so much that you have to untangle in regard to the political skill of presenting a persona to get people's collective identity to identify with that and support that, as distinct from looking at policy and impacts on humans economically. And then underneath that, there's a whole psychological analysis that can be done in terms of like, damn, what was that dude doing on Epstein's island? And like what's actually going on with somebody who can have such a layered reality in terms of like the superficial and the substantial. And then even deeper than that, like what is the relationship to whatever the deep state is and the CIA and how, the military industrial complex might actually drive a lot of decision making and this individual's relationship to that, which we can never really know, but based on what actually happened in terms of military and war policy and things like that, you can start to think about them very differently, I guess is what I'm saying. So, and ultimately you're left with realizing like, I don't know who that dude is at all. Like, it's just, we're so mediated. There's so many levels of mediation between my sense making and the reality that is, William Clinton, it's just it becomes like this like avatar of a hyper object of projection. It's actually quite interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking about him the other day because I was looking at some old electoral maps, right? So Reagan
Mhm.
cleans up, and then second election, he cleans up even more. He basically
Mhm.
sweeps the entire country, takes almost
Mhm.
every state, which is an indictment of the electoral system down there.
Mhm.
But
Yeah.
nonetheless, you think, oh wow, all the people must have been leaning right or really agreed with his statements or his policies. But then a very small number of years later, all those states go over to Clinton. And you go, whoa, did the
Yeah.
people all change? Or are we
Yeah.
really mostly voting for characters we see on TV? And
Mhm.
it doesn't really matter that much whether they reflect our policies and sensibilities or not. So
Yeah.
for me, that brings up a question like, what's the difference between what it takes to win elections and what it takes to be a good president?
Mm. Yeah, that is an interesting one. And it's funny, Jimmy Carter comes to mind with that question because I don't know a ton about Carter, but my impression is that he wasn't always was and continued to be just a solid, good person, good intentions, not stupid. Maybe the complexities of his presidency made things go one way or the other for a variety of reasons that were maybe out of his control, or maybe he did ultimately bear responsibility for how things played out for him. But it just brings to light this contrast between, I feel like he brings to light that discrepancy between being a good president and a good person isn't necessarily what makes one successful in this game of politics, even though he won an election. So yeah, I think there's a actually really tragic distinction there. I mean, my sense is that we're actually in a situation right now where we very much need to bring those things more into closer alignment. We have to find a way to make it so that the people who will be good at the job are the ones who are more likely to get elected. And it seems very much the case that we're not in that situation right now. In fact, it's quite distinct. The skills and the qualities and the reasons why someone gets elected are don't really pan out in terms of what would make them a good president. And almost to an extreme degree, I feel like that really, in some ways, that's one of the most extreme characteristics of the situation that we're in right now, is that there's such a huge gap between what's needed and what would be good for the country and the kinds of person that our system orients us toward voting for, selecting for. I mean, it's just this past election was such an extreme and almost surreal example of that, where it seemed like the two candidates that we had were very widely not wanted by most people. I mean, it's just really bizarre if you think like what kind of culture are we living in where we make it so that we are choosing between two people that most people don't like. It's so strange. Mm,
Yeah, it's hard for me to get a sense of what people really like or don't like.
mm,
As I
mhm,
think a lot of people are like, "Oh, that guy is terrible," but there's a layer of their mind that
mhm,
gets off on seeing his victories or his indulgences, or
mhm.
we want to publicly complain about their lapses, but we don't
Yeah,
always mean that we wouldn't like to enjoy similar lapses ourselves, or
yeah,
we don't just love
yeah.
having some weird emperor or empress or something like that sometimes.
Mm. Yeah, no, that's a good point. It's a good point. And to what extent are we just not transparent to ourselves? And it's almost like individually and collectively, we somehow have to find a way to do the work where we are more transparent and diaphanous to ourselves so that we're clear about our own impulses and our own human nature and our own desires. We sort of have to clarify our desire individually and collectively so that we can actually have that desire manifest in candidates that would actually reflect what we would want to present as our conscious desire, right? And in the absence of that, we're getting maybe these unconscious, unprocessed sort of symptoms. It's almost like the candidates that we get are symptoms of our repressed desires or something, where it's like we really want Trump, but we can't admit it to ourselves. And those who do are easily sort of caricatured or demonized or ridiculed because it actually is, in some ways, those lower, less mature parts of themselves that are coming out like, yeah, make America great again. And that's almost abhorrent to, I think, a decent percentage of the population. But actually, is there some, projection there or just suppression of that MAGA in all of us that needs to find a way to be better integrated? And for me, that's, I think for you and I both, probably some line of that thinking is really important because it does come down to having a view of the many layered aspects of our individual and collective psyches and how to have a healthy integration of all those different layers. And we're definitely really far away from healthy, healing, holistic integration of the human psyche. So it's coming out in really distorted and just sometimes ugly and irrational ways, and ultimately, that's not good for the body politic, And there's definitely sort of as within, so without, right? Like we're gonna get the politics and the government that we sort of deserve based on the health of our collective psyche, I think, at some level.
So you were saying that right up into the Obama era, that you were, retrospectively, somewhat embarrassingly, just unthinkingly identified with the corporate center left of the
Hmm.
nation.
Hmm.
Um, how did that start to change for you? What happened
Mm.
that made it a more complex thing?
Yeah, I guess a combination of people, so exposure to well-informed and intelligent and thoughtful people through both personal relationships and online exposure. So I think I've benefited from digital media and social media, even though I'm also a pretty harsh critic of it. I feel like I've benefited from it through exposure to people like yourself and some of our mutual associates and people we've gotten to know. That plus ongoing reading and study and spiritual practice. So I'd say, the years, the past 20 years have coincided with me just sort of being a seeker of truth and knowledge and information. I feel like increasing my ability to take different perspectives. So there's sort of a developmental journey of maturity that I've kind of gone through, combined with exposure to more perspectives and more interesting perspectives. And I'd say too, going through that, going through those, going through that developmental arc personally, combined with the collective experiences that we've all gone through, I feel like, as with many other people, I was really impacted by the experience of COVID and the experience of the Trump years, the experience of what's been happening in culture in terms of what's being referred to as woke culture, trying to understand that psychologically. Yeah, so I feel like all those things sort of combine for me to allow a sort of attempt to look at all of those things happening, and to have my identity be not so much a default collective political identity, but more, if I'm going to be an individual, a sort of spiritual, philosophical individual in particular, how then am I able to look at these different things? So partly it is the formation of a new kind of identity, and maybe ultimately we need to have containers for our identity, and I had to find new and better ones that enabled me to look at my prior ones.
How seriously do you take the idea of the soul of a nation or of
Mm,
some kind of quasi-agentic collective ethos or nation spirit?
yeah. I don't know. That's an open question for me. One of my more recent influences has been reading Rudolf Steiner, and for me that question brings him up because there is in his thinking this sense of there are these collective identities and almost entities, and even at a lower level, like as an organization, as a culture, as a country, there may be not just a sense of collective shared identity, but there might also be various forces or beings or entities at work that are influencing things. And that's a whole nother direction to the conversation we probably don't want to go in. But I am, with all humility, pretty agnostic and open-minded about those things. So I really don't know. My sense is that there are a lot of factors at play that we really don't understand very well, and that there may very well be something to that. But even in a less esoteric sense, there's definitely, just by virtue of our socialization, I think there is a shared sense of a collective identity that is meaningful even today and even for people who come to the United States, who are brought in by the sort of values and ideas and ideals of the nation that is meaningful and does have a big impact on people, whether they realize it or not. And for many people, they do realize it, and it actually is a big part of their meaning making about who they are and why they're here and what we're all doing together. So I'd say it's meaningful, but there's a lot we don't know about how that is all working and operating on us.
Yeah, I feel very imaginally and emotionally connected to the sense of
Mm,
a cultivated coherence that joins people across their differences. But at the
mm,
same time, I'm highly suspicious that borders on maps from the last couple hundred years would
mm.
define collective entities of some kind in any
Yeah.
real or organic fashion.
Yeah, good point. I think it's yeah, it's interesting to think about what would be the demarcations or what would be like. I think about that in terms of like race too. Like I don't, there's ways in which to me the directionality is to realize a sort of transracial oneness of humanity. There's a sort of obvious simplicity to that and understanding the way that the construction of race got constructed over time. um, which is again a separate topic, but it is relevant here because it's like, well, where are those lines? Like there are differences between cultures, and we don't want to over reify something like race, and yet you also just can't deny that different people grow up in different areas of the world and that there are cultural differences that are real. But then if you take a transincarnational view, it just sort of complicates it too. Like what's the relationship across time? And as an individual, to what degree does it make sense to identify with even the culture that you're in at the moment? There's so many different registers we can take across time. So I don't know. I really don't know how appropriate it is in the grand scheme of things to sort of reify or identify with collective cultural or historical or geographic identities.
If I play with it, if I play with
Hmm.
the idea
Yeah.
of an American spirit,
Yeah.
and then I look back over my imaginary history of the United States, it looks
Hmm.
like there were times where the vitality was strong. It looks like, boy, that whole New Deal thing seemed pretty interesting. And then there was this
Hmm.
war that they won, and it involved retooling the whole economy and mixing everybody around, and prosperity and planes and rockets, and like
Hmm.
America was just inventing things left and right and implementing them as soon as they were invented in a really
Hmm.
dynamic way. So that when we think make America great again, we kind of are imagining, oh, yeah, the war and just after the war when we were really doing something. And a lot of
Hmm.
people seem to me, in listening to them, have a sense that there's a stagnation that's been going on for a while.
Hmm. Hmm.
Do you relate
Hmm.
to a story like that, or what's your
Hmm.
sense of the fluctuations of the dynamism of America?
Yeah, I think for me it makes sense to understand that story as a part of the larger story of the rising and falling of civilizations and empires. So and like one frame that I've seen is if you look at the history of what group of people have been sort of the dominant economic force on the planet, even if you just at least since modernization, if you look at sort of the Dutch Empire, right, into the British Empire, into the American Empire, having this sense of cycles of power and empire makes sense. Like everything's gonna have a life cycle. And in that sense, I feel like part of the story we're living out, which I think dovetails with a lot of people's intuition, even if they don't have robust historical frames or knowledge, is that we are potentially past the apex and in some sort of decline. Right? I think that speaks to what you just spoke to. And even this nostalgic wanting to make it great again is in some ways incredibly cynical and pessimistic because it really is acknowledging we are no longer great. We're actually experiencing a fall. And I think that is a legitimate sense. I think we are probably having some sort of decline, and nobody knows what, like, we can look back and see what declines and collapses have looked like in the past. Even that's fuzzy, right? Because none of us actually read that many books to become experts about what was the decline of the Dutch Empire like and the British Empire like, and what are the patterns between that and the fall of the Roman Empire, and are there patterns even between the fall of previous civilizations like the Maya and the Inca or whatever? So there's so many civilizational changes that have happened that have a sort of rise and fall element to them. So I think it's very reasonable to tell a story that we are experiencing the decline of the American empire, but nobody knows how that's going to play out or what it's going to look like or how long it's going to take or how different or similar it's going to be to the past because things are so different now than they've ever been in the past. But I think that's part of my story, and that's part of a lot of people's story, whether you're talking about the meta crisis or whether you're just acknowledging that you want to make America great again, which are two very different stories. You're kind of both telling different versions of the same story, which is that things are going to shit and it might get hard. Yeah. So buckle up. Yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting one for me because I think about it sort of feels to me like there's a sweet spot between unity and diversity in populations. Uh, Nietzsche wrote this funny thing. Nietzsche was ferociously anti-German most of the time, took no pride in being regarded as a German, but he did say he didn't think they were inherently racist. He said that he felt like they'd taken in too many of what they perceived as non-Germans and they couldn't digest
Mm,
it and they were about to get sick and throw up and
mm,
make a mess. And this was, 1880, 1890, just sort of
hmm
pre-German outburst.
hmm
And it's interesting to think, oh, there is this kind of thing like, oh, that diversity was too strong for our unity field to hold. And
hmm
so when that's the case, you get these two options. One is like, hey, let's roll things back. Let's start chopping a bunch of this diversity out of the
hmm
system until we had a nice balance again. But then
hmm
the other attitude strikes me as being more confident. We're like, hey, we could actually expand or grow a new unity that would absorb this diversity and then we kind of feel all the same again. But
Yeah.
you have to have that attitude that that's even something you could try as a nation. And I'm
Yeah.
curious how much, I know you don't have the answer, but how much is the material circumstances? Like, how much is it the decline of the American empire and the changing global economics and technological environment and the rise of the BRICS nations or whatever it is, versus how much is
hmm
America just uncertain whether it thinks it has the ability to try to absorb the moment and move forward anymore.
Mm. Yeah, I love that question, and it's such an important dynamic to name is that tension between unity and diversity, and it's interesting to see even that historical example of Germany because it is a true and important theme and pattern that you do have to have unity and diversity. There has to be some sense of coherence of this is us, right? And it doesn't need to be overly racialized and it doesn't need to be overly stagnant, but it still is the case that any group of people is going to have a sense of we. And one of the things I think that's interesting about this period of time we're in now is not only can we fit some semblance of the pattern to previous patterns of different empires or civilizations, but also we might be opening up into a new era of sort of globalized collectivity, right? So because we're also connected globally, we're experiencing like the change, if not the decline, of American unity and diversity in the context of globalization in an unprecedented way, where it might not just be this pattern of like, okay, who's next? Is it China? Is it Russia? Or no, is it something totally different because we're becoming more global? So it's not just going to be, Dutch, British, American, Chinese. It's going to be something new. And I think the even that model of looking at those empires does sort of overly reduce it to economics and thinking about economic and military power. But what you're pointing to is cultural changes that I think are very relevant now. And but it is related to economics and the fact that the dollar is the global reserve currency and the fact that debt is real and impactful and difficult for people to understand. And something is happening right now with money and the dollar and debt and the emergence of Bitcoin, actually, and cryptocurrency, which enables a whole new possibility for a different kind of money in exchange that's actually transnational. So that's interesting. So what's happening economically with the emergence of blockchain and the sort of extreme weight of debt in our current fiat system. That's all relevant to the collapse of the American empire, but so is this more cultural level of like, who are we? And how do we maintain a coherent sense of collective agency if we don't have a shared sense of values? And not only is that similar to the kind of tension that countries have always had, like what is Germanness if it's overrun by people from all over the world who don't identify as German, and then they're all living in Germany, then what does it mean to be German? That's a legit question. Similarly for us though, like what does it mean to be American if, millions and millions of people are coming to the country without a sense of being American? How does that change what it means to be an American? That's a legit question that people on the left have to grapple with better, but also it's happening in the context of a sort of global postmodern confusion about even having a sense of real value and shared values and principles. So it's a real mess. It's a real mess. But I think the sense of needing a shared identity is key, and it's why people want to make America great again. But it's also people on the left who don't like MAGA need a better answer to who are we and what are our shared values and how do you keep that coherent. But that's made more complicated by the fact that we also might need to grow that question into a global answer. And my sense is that we might need a global answer to that question in order to get the kind of coherence that we need.
Yeah, it's really, I mean, nation states are really interesting. A lot of them are surprisingly recent historically, so it's hard
Mm,
to really imagine they represent actual units or organs of a planetary system.
mm,
A lot of
mhm,
them were imposed by someone else that just cut
mhm,
across the boundaries of peoples. But there's still this open question about suppose the planetary is coming into manifestation. Does that require us to draw down nationalism to some degree?
mm,
Or is it something about patriotism and nationalism that actually uploads people into the global environment, right? Is it America first, Canada first, Britain first, Russia
mm,
first? If we were all in our expansive identity modes, is that how you form a planetary society? Or do you inherently have to give up some of that identity in order to be part of a bigger
mm.
context?
Yeah, another good question. It's so rich because I feel like these things are happening and unfolding however we feel about it, but there's so many different degrees of maturity with which we can hold and embody these things that are happening, regardless of whether we want them to or not. Right? Like there is this globalization move happening, and there I feel like against our will and without our conscious effort, there is globalization happening. And I feel like we are being brought into this opportunity to have a more just human universal sense of identity. But I think it could also be seen as a mistake to oversimplify that and think that the role of family, community, and maybe nation don't play a role, right? I think if we sort of put on our integral hats, we would probably be more inclined to make the argument for some sort of nested healthy identity as opposed to just erasing the underlayers, because then you end up in some sort of potentially like dystopian world where if everyone's just human and you sort of erase the underlayers of like family and community and country, there's a way in which that can bleed into what I would think of as a not healthy version of just oversimplified, like almost materialist, like, well then like what's the importance of family and community? We can just all be sort of in a sort of matrix, where it's just like we don't have real embodied connections to other real people and family and community and culture. So I think, and I don't think we want to go in that direction. My intuition is very strongly that that's not the way to go. We don't want to just be all plugged in, sort of denatured, de-embodied, de-embedded, decultured, denationed, sort of generic humans, right? That there's something not human about that. There's something machine-like about that. And I don't think we want to go in that direction, but I think there are things moving us in that direction. And maybe the answer is we have to find a way to re-embody and re-embed ourselves in actual communities and cultures, but maybe that don't need to be, they don't necessarily need to be racialized or nationalized, but they have to be something. I feel like they have to be embodied. I think is maybe more important. And in that sense, there's a sort of obvious overlap between nation and like it's where you are geographically. Like I do think it will be healthy for humans to be embedded and embodied in real communities that have place on the earth. And there needs to be some sort of nested identity there. So it's a really interesting, these are all really open, emergent questions that we're gonna find the answers to very sloppily, I think, over time.
The American embodied and embedded identity is often pointed to as having some historical wounds around things like slavery, around things like the mass death and cultural degradation of indigenous peoples. What's your personal sense of whether or the degree to which a people has to look back and try to heal these unresolved features of the collective psyche in order to move forward or not?
Hmm. Yeah, another good question. I think we do, and I think we're trying. But my sense is that one of the places we're getting stuck there is we're not maybe going far enough or global enough. It seems like my sense of that conversation and the way that that question is being answered in the culture right now is pretty confused because it seems to me that a lot of the people who have the impulse to do that work and to do some healing, they're still stuck in overly, for whatever reason, like circumscribed and narrow views of history where they're like maybe hyper focused on the genocide of Native Americans and or the transatlantic slave trade. But for some reason, those tragedies aren't held appropriately in the broader context of the slavery that took place all around the world throughout history and the various different kinds of genocide and war and human sacrifice that happened throughout history cross culturally and across history. So I feel like we have to keep going in that direction, but open up more to the whole of human history. Um, and just have a more global and like a global and total historical attempt to come to terms with the again the dignities and the disasters and the tragedies of human suffering and war and conflict, um, and that has to be done on some level, but to go about that by focusing on particular instances of that throughout history can maybe be counterproductive. I feel like that's part of the tension we're coming up against is because people are focusing on certain instances of harm and genocide and slavery, um, that can reinforce sort of historically contingent divisions between people that played out in those times and places. But to see that as an even broader pattern, I would think, and seems to me to be more potentially healing and unifying because it's really when we all drop into, again, like we have this shared story. And if our primary identity is as humans and not with a particular race or country, to me, it opens up new and deeper possibilities for healing. So you kind of have, I don't know what the chicken and the egg feedback loop is in terms of like how to facilitate feeling grounded in a sort of human universal, deep historical identity that we can sort of try to hold in our awareness versus like I'm a white American, therefore I need to heal like the genocide of Native Americans and the transatlantic slave trade. I feel like that already it puts me in a bind that's really hard to get out of. If I frame it in that more narrow way, it doesn't seem like there's an actually easier or maybe even possible resolution. It's almost like recreating the bind and the limits of my identity. So my sense is that we don't want to approach it that way, and that's the way many people are approaching it, and it's creating not the outcomes that they want.
You were talking a little while ago about the insufficiency of the candidates, right? That in the
Mm,
last election, or maybe in the last few election cycles, barring the fact that we might not be transparent to ourselves about our actual
mhm,
preferences,
mhm.
it's pretty easy to look at these elections and go, wow, both sides really suck and both candidates really suck. South Park made this thing about a
Yeah.
competition between a douche and a turd sandwich back in the day.
Yeah. Yeah.
But who have you seen in the last, say, couple
Mm,
election cycles, or who's on the scene that gives you, if not hope, some curiosity, some interest? You think, oh, maybe that's part of the way forward for my country is
mhm.
embodied in that person or that approach or something like that.
Yeah. I mean, unfortunately, few and far between. I think. Yeah, it's funny. My initial impression of Andrew Yang was not totally positive, but I think I came to appreciate him more over time. I think that his sensibility and his intention is actually definitely a part of the signal that we need to boost up. I think that Bernie Sanders had a lot right. And I think in many ways that was a real breaking point for the collective psyche and body politic of our country. I feel like we should, there's a way in which we should have moved in that direction. And in 2016, my intuition remains that there is a sort of underlying tacit should, like that should have happened and it didn't, and now we're all sort of suffering the consequences. We had this opportunity to go in that direction, which would have been, I think, just better in a lot of ways. But again, in hindsight of these past 8 years, I'd say I've become more critical of Bernie and a little bit more disenchanted and realizing more of the shortcomings of his perspective and his platform. But it still would have been a move in the right direction, even though it's far, far from perfect and actually probably no longer what we need. It may be what would have been our best choice 8 years ago, and then now it's no longer sufficient. But I think, an element of what he was trying to do, and even just at a human level, I remain convinced that he seems just to be a genuinely good, ethical, moral person who's literally just trying to do what he thinks is best for people, which is actually saying something, and you can't take it for granted all the time. Um, Fetterman's an interesting dude, but I tried to listen to him in conversation recently and was really just had the gut sense of like, there's no way that he could really take it to the next level. I don't think he has enough coherence or articulation or ability to really um, just be the sort of political force that we need. So I'd say, some combination of Bernie and Yang and Fetterman kind of stands out to me. And those are all so, and there's also something I will say, I think that what the most interesting thing, or one of the most interesting that's happening right now with the new Trump administration, is this team of people he's brought together. And there are elements of Kennedy and Gabbard that I think are relevant for the American psyche, right? Like there's something that they're bringing into the conversation that is resonating with people, and it's important, and it has to do with truth, at least in the sense of even if some things that they say aren't true, the impulse that people are attracted to is that an individual can try to present and represent a sort of unpopular anti-status quo take on things. And if that take on things is grounded in some truth, that should matter and that should win out, and that we can't just go along with sort of manufactured consent around important topics. And I feel like whether they're right or wrong about the details that they try to talk about, they're trying to and are to some degree effectively embodying that impulse of like truth should matter. We can't just go along with popular narratives. We have to question things. We have to have the integrity to ask difficult questions. And I think that needs to be an element of leaders of the future is they have to actually signal to people and be genuine in their impulse to cut through bullshit and to cut through sort of socialized manufactured forces of consent and status quo sort of just perpetuation of overly simple strategic narratives and propaganda.
So something that's standing out to me there is a bunch of those people get designated as crazy or unreasonable in the
Hmm.
current operating system, right? Like
Hmm.
Bernie's crazy, Yang's a little crazy, Marianne Williamson is crazy, Trump is
Yeah.
crazy, RFK Jr. is crazy. Even when you watch like general media, political comedy, you see like RFK Jr. He's an interesting, complicated
Hmm.
guy in a lot of ways.
Hmm.
But the joke is always, what a crazy weirdo. Cutting the heads off whales
Yeah.
and killing bears and eating roadkill, and he had a brain worm. And you're like, okay,
Yeah.
what does it mean to you that, I don't really know. I'm not even sure how to formulate this question, but it seems like there's a status of people who are designated as crazy in the system.
Hmm.
And is it possible that those are like the holding positions at the edge of the system that actually show us parts of what we would need in order to move forward?
Yeah. I think what you just said at the end there, there's some important truth in that. But again, what's interesting and so complicated about it is for any of those individuals, any particular thing that they're saying may or may not be true or even borderline crazy. Like and it's so hard to hold that both and of like, yes, what they're bringing is so important in terms of being able to push against popular, overly manufactured and curated narratives and propaganda and seeing that we live in an environment of perpetual propaganda. Like we live in a media ecology of just perpetual ubiquitous propaganda. And that's what we're working with. And there's something about those people that's fighting against that. And that is important, but it doesn't mean any particular thing that they say is necessarily true or good. But the impulse is important, and we have to at least be open to hearing and thinking about what they're saying because we have to determine ultimately what is true or not, what is propaganda versus what is educational information. And we need so there's sort of like this antibody that's sort of fighting against this virus of ubiquitous propaganda. Um, but that doesn't mean, people who see the ubiquitous propaganda and then see the people fighting against it, it's all too easy to then just buy whatever they're selling and think that they're telling the truth about whatever they're saying. And unfortunately, that's not always the case. They might also be wrong for various reasons. So it's really, really difficult for us to really just to make sense and find out what's true, which is ultimately a big sort of part of the context of this whole conversation that we're having is we're living in a sort of post-truth world where it's hard to do real sense making. And somehow leadership and political leadership has to be aware of that and shining a light on that, which some of these people are doing, but then also has to somehow help get us to the next step of not just fighting against propaganda machines, but actually pointing out and giving people justified arguments for how and why they're trustworthy and actually able to make sense of things.
It's a pretty big ask to have somebody who's oriented toward truth and can make arguments about why they're trustworthy, but also has enough of the performative characteristics to win a general election.
Yeah.
I'm curious, and not that it's necessarily the case that the Democrats are going to save anybody, but if anybody in the country could be picked to run for them in 4 years,
Hmm.
what kind of person should they run? Like who could win an election? It
Yeah.
doesn't even have to be anybody in politics, but like if you just survey your sense of America, who would people vote for?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I don't, do we need some sort of benevolent celebrity, like almost like it's funny. Somehow it came up jokingly, I think, in my family of like if Tom Cruise ran for president, he'd win, like or something like some sort of like we need another celebrity type person, but who happens to be oriented toward these things that we're talking about. Yeah, because I don't know. It's a really it is a really high bar. And there are, more maybe wonkish intellectual type people who get a lot of the things that we're talking about and would maybe be helpful in making sense of things and even decision making, but who are not going to do well in a debate or in the media. But to what degree do we need to take that as a given and feed the people what they want? Or to what degree do we need to somehow shift that whole dynamic and make it so that we're not just electing the kind of people that we're electing? Um, my sense is that your sense is that there's something psychological and fundamental about that need that's not really easy to displace or transcend. So we're not going to get to a place where we no longer are attracted to people like Trump. We somehow have to find a way to work with that. And I feel like that's partly behind your question, and I guess I'd find that hard to argue against. But it does just make it really quite a pickle. But it's also more this collective sense of there's a lot going on collectively, and there's a lot going on in the group collective psyche that's playing out. And we collectively are going to get representatives of our collective psyche one way or the other. So I feel like at the end of the day, maybe it's not very helpful, but we are kind of getting what we want and deserve, and we will continue to do so. So I think we will answer the question by the person who rises to the top is an expression of what we are collectively actually wanting at that time, even if our public narrative is different from that. So we'll see. The truth will be revealed through who we end up allowing to rise to the top.
What are you, I mean, your country's just had this election.
Mm.
What are you worried about? And what are you excited about as
Mm.
possibilities over the next 4 years?
Yeah. Well, based on, I've just read something this morning about the escalation with Ukraine and Russia that Biden is seems to be instigating right now. So one thing that's at the front of my mind at the moment is like, wow, is escalation of the two wars that are getting the most attention right now, in Israel and Ukraine. Are there escalation possibilities there, that I think most people are really not thinking are realistic? Like I think most people are living in a world in their head where nuclear war isn't possible. We just sort of are assuming that that's just not going to happen because it sounds so crazy. But I don't know. So part of me feels like that's still maybe in terms of worst case scenario is escalation of war, which is interesting too because it's so outside of what gets our collective attention for the most part. Like we're so caught up in the dramas of personalities and scandals and cabinet appointments that I feel like we're not collectively paying enough attention to actual war. So that's something that I think needs to come to more of our surface collective consciousness, and maybe it will do so through some terrible thing. That's possible. Um, but I'm excited about, my sense is that the aftermath of Trump getting elected initially, I think actually shows some positive signs culturally in that, it didn't lead to, I feel like the sense is more acceptance than people even anticipated. And even though there might be really problematic and troubling things about his presidency, I feel like overall, collectively, people there is this deep desire to get over the polarization. And even people who really, really hate Trump are getting a kind of feedback that they weren't getting 8 years ago. I feel like 8 years ago, the hatred was so intense and so justified. And now it still is, but also there's more balancing feedback around like maybe it's time to do a little introspection. Like maybe like people on the left sort of trying to understand what went wrong. There's a little bit more self-reflection happening, I think, on the left. And I think the ways in which we're sort of becoming post woke and sort of reflecting on woke like what's happening in the collective psyche of the left is really interesting right now because it's being forced to reflect on why Trump has won twice, what was wrong with this hyper object of woke culture. And that process is hopefully a learning process. So I feel like the left is slowly and painfully learning, and more people are gonna disembed from the more sort of extreme versions of the left and maybe come into more of a better balance and not necessarily just becoming more moderate or middle or center, but actually finding a higher order of sense making within which they can integrate what can now be the object, which was their prior subject of their leftist perspective. If now they can take that as an object, then maybe they can grow to a higher order integration where they're able to understand the Trump supporter and understand their former sort of leftist activist self in something new. Um, Whereas the folks who I think are sort of moderate right and right, there's still some deep impulse in that psyche that needs to be like validated and integrated as well. And they've been so like aggressively wanting attention and wanting validation that it's okay to be patriotic, it's okay to be American, it's okay to be white, it's okay to be a man. Like there's something there that is fighting for validation and integration. And maybe this recent iteration of sort of that voice being heard somehow collectively, even though if actually it wasn't simple at all in terms of racial and gender, like it was actually much more multiracial um, and female influenced than sort of popular narratives would have us believe. There's still something there about that sort of traditional consciousness being acknowledged and integrated. So my hope is that the direction we're moving in is Trump's reelection is in service of reintegrating the traditional and the sort of red, and that the reflection and the feedback on the left forces the sort of postmodern modern green to sort of recalibrate and maybe up level more people so that kind of both things are happening at the same time and you get the possibility for just a better weave of perspectives where you get a sort of validated, reaffirmed traditional, you get a more sort of self-critical, self-reflective, less self-righteous green left. So maybe both versions can be better versions of themselves and maybe learn how to get along a little bit. I guess that's my hope.
Yeah, that's a great benevolent, transpartisan, developmental wish for your nation. I really
It
appreciate
is.
that.
Yeah.
Um, if my goal, I guess we're coming to the end here, if my
Hmm.
goal is to elicit the state of a country and the state of the imaginal nation's soul through the lens of what is both personal and metacognitive, um, is there anything else I should have asked you to do that?
Mm. I think we covered some good ground, we definitely covered some good ground. I guess no, nothing really comes to mind. I think it's just so hard to speak for large groups of people, Like at the end of the day, there's just so much diversity and there's so many different perspectives on things, and we're all so limited in our exposure to and awareness of other people's perspectives. Like we're all looking through some prism of whatever our information ecosystem is. And, my perspective is definitely so limited. It's really just completely mind-blowing to think about the fact that there's billions of different perspectives on this shared reality. And somehow we're finding our way to come into alignment with each other and sort of shared behavior while while talking to individuals about these things, you realize just how radically unique and individual different perspectives are. Even, people we know in common, talking to my wife, talking to my close friends, like we all see things differently. Like I don't know anyone who sees things exactly the way that I do. right? Like you and I have a lot of overlap in how we view the world, but also some real differences. And I've over these past few months, I'd say one thing that really has come up for me is I've been blessed to have really great in-depth conversations with some really thoughtful people. And we've been navigating and exploring real points of tension and disagreement and difference of perspective. And I have yet to find anyone who it's just like all agreement all the time. So there's just something really interesting and beautiful and worth mentioning about that of just like the we talk about groups and we talk about the left and the right and the blue and the red and the integral and the modern and the traditional, and yet we really actually are individuals. We are unique individuals with unique, unprecedented perspectives, and that's just it's so amazing and humbling. It's really something to appreciate.
Mm. One last question, which is, I know a part of you is periodically tempted to enter into a more political
Mm,
life. What
mm,
do you think it would take for you to become more involved in the political per se?
mm. Yeah, you're right. I mean, and it relates back to just seeing the what's what seems to be the case that the people that are put in front of us as leaders just don't seem good enough. I feel like myself and some other people I know could potentially be good leaders and be good political leaders. So I don't know. It's interesting how money is so involved in politics. So I think we both have to figure out how to improve the relationship between money and politics, and specifically money and like political campaigns. So either something big has to shift there to change how we create access to things like political participation, if you're thinking in terms of like actually being a candidate, or something, unexpected would have to happen for someone like myself or someone like me to somehow have access to huge amounts of capital to actually have a real chance. I feel like I don't want personally to run for office, but I would be willing to if somehow a situation transpired where it just seemed like that was in front of me as a possibility. I feel like I'd be willing to sacrifice myself potentially for that, but I'm not really seeking it. So, and maybe that is part of the problem. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what we need to do to get more people, I would say like us and lots of people we know to really maybe actively pursue it. But there's sort of an irony there because, the people that we'd most want are probably the people who don't want it, and the people who are really striving for it are probably also the people that we don't want. So there's a weird sort of paradox there. I don't know how we resolve it. I know for me personally though, it's just intuitively correct to just affirm that I don't actually want it, but I'd be willing to do it. Mm.
Thank you. This has been great. This has been a really rich take. I appreciate how much of your life and your thinking you've shared,
Mm.
and God bless America, I guess.
Thank you, brother. God bless you. God bless Canada, and God bless America.
Cheers. Good to see you, man.
Cheers.